Hello, folks. Hello and welcome to the Apologetics Academy. This is a webinar which I run often on Saturdays. The idea is that we bring on different scholars, apologists, thinkers from across the theological spectrum to present on different topics of interest to Christians, especially those topics which concern the question of whether or not Christianity is true. We have normally our speaker give a presentation, then take a Q&A, and there's a number of ways you can participate in the interactive Q&A. You can click the raise hand button at the top of your screen, and at the appropriate time I'll promote you to be a co-panelist with our guest speaker, and you'll have opportunity to interact and dialogue and engage with him that way. You can also submit questions anonymously if you wish by clicking the Q&A button at the top of your screen. I will read the question to the guest speaker, and you can engage that way as well. You can find the website, by the way, at apologetics-academy.org. So I update the schedule there, where you can find out about upcoming webinars, and you can also subscribe to the mailing list to be notified by email when I have upcoming webinars forthcoming. So without further ado, let's turn to this evening's or today's discussion. I'm with Bobby Conway, whom many of you might know from the 1 Minute Apologist, one of my favorite apologetics video podcasts. And Bobby has written a book called Doubting Towards Faith, which is exploring doubt and it's how we can use it to grow in our confidence about the truth of the Christian faith. So Bobby, do you want to maybe give us a little bit of background about your book and some of the subject material of that, and then we'll just launch into discussion. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, you bet. Well, hello to everybody who is on with us right now. And Jonathan, thank you for the opportunity to chat with you. I know that our time reference is far apart. I think it's about midnight where you are, right? Or 9 o'clock at night?
No, actually only 8:12
here. 8, yeah, that's right. It'd be 8 o'clock. I'm still getting things confused. So I'm in Southern California and it's noon my time. But yes, I hope that we can have a good time together. My passion for doubt really came through a battle that I ended up going through in my own life. When I became a Christian, I was looking to get 2 questions answered. What is the purpose of my life? And what do I do with my guilt? And when I became a Christian, I did so because I really came to believe that Jesus could deal with my guilt. And he said, I've come that you might have life and life abundantly and give us meaning and purpose. But as I began to grow in my walk, so too did my questions. And depending upon which church or which Bible college one goes to, if they feel led into ministry, you'll get a long list or a short list of doctrinal beliefs. And I ended up in a very legalistic Bible college. It was very black and white. And I was young and impressionable, and I began just to take on whatever beliefs I was taught. But I say that if somebody's a creative analyzer, they'll begin to think their way through some of these doctrinal boxes that they were put in. And so what ended up happening is I found myself questioning my beliefs that I was given. And that's one of the reasons I even say as a father to my kids or to other parents, don't try to get your kids to believe in a long list of doctrines too early. In other words, don't get them to commit to their positions too quickly, because we might be setting them up for a future crisis of faith. We want them to be able to think through the different views and let them know there's lots of different alternative views out there to enjoy learning. And I wish in my early discipleship, I would have been told there's lots of different viewpoints out there. Instead, under some legalistic teaching, I was taught there's only this viewpoint and this viewpoint and this viewpoint. And what ends up happening to people when they're taught that way in a very legalistic format, if they're analytical, as I said, if they think about things, if they're put in too small of a doctrinal box, they'll eventually start to press up against those walls. And the danger is to basically push the walls down altogether. And what I've come to believe is that God has given us a big box to live in. We're to love God, love people, and celebrate the gospel. And I think about this idea that it wasn't until AD 49 that we have the first book of the New Testament written, Galatians. That's about 16 years after the resurrection. Well, when we look to the early church and we want to see a beautiful picture of what we aspire to be like, we look to Acts 2. And we go, man, we want to live an Acts 2 life. Well, in Acts 2, we don't even have the first book of the New Testament yet. But what do we see them doing? Loving God, loving people, celebrating the gospel. And so all of a sudden, that perspective freed me to step back and realize that a lot of the questions that I even concerned myself with, these weren't even the big issues of the early church. Now, this doesn't mean we aren't to do apologetics. This doesn't mean we aren't to think philosophically, not at all. But what it does mean is if we aren't aware of how all of these issues kind of came into formation through the history of time, we can end up losing this Acts 2 passion for God while we sit around trying to figure out, do we believe in a northern or a southern theory of the the Galatian theory, or do we believe in this particular issue over this particular issue? And what I would want to say is to the listeners that we are called to do apologetics, and apologetics often arises out of the cultural issues of our day, and we engage in the different issues, and we provide feedback on what the scriptures would say. But when it comes to our doctrines, I think as it relates to creation, instead of like splintering the church to death in the name of our pet particularities over young earth and old earth and all that, well, what is Genesis 1 and 2 about? It's telling us that God created us in his image to steward his universe. Now, me personally, I'm an old earth person, but I'm not going to splinter the church over that debate. So how does the young earther and the old earther step back and connect? Well, we connect on the fact that God created us. Same thing with Jesus returning. He's going to return, but we often put people in a tight little box of pre-trib or post-trib, and then the person begins to doubt their pre-trib and think, man, maybe I'm a post-tribber now. And if we could step back and teach through discipleship, we believe that God created, we believe that Jesus is coming again, and then enjoy studying these different angles on that. That's great, because many people will go read the Left Behind series, commit to pre-trib, and then they'll struggle with doubt later on because they read a post-tribber. So for me, what ended up happening, Jonathan, is I went to Bible college to learn about what it means that I went to Bible college to learn about what it means for me to be a Christian. Then I went off to seminary to get a theology degree to learn about my Bible, and then did a 4-year master's degree, a THM, Master's of Theology. Then I went and did a doctorate of ministry in apologetics because I wanted apologetics to help me with my theology. And then I went and did a philosophy degree, which I'm almost done with, in order to learn about my apologetics. So in doubt, it's funny, the Christian trajectory, we often get saved and we want to learn about our Bible, but then we need apologetics to help us with our Bible. And then, then we need philosophy to help us with our apologetics. And in the midst of all of my doubt, studying Nietzsche and all the different philosophers, I found myself needing something bigger than even philosophy. And it was returning to that simple trust, becoming like a little child again, loving God, loving people, celebrating the gospel. Thomas Aquinas wrote a ton of books, but it is said that toward the end of his life, he had a mystical experience that was so powerful that he put down his pen and he said, all is but straw compared to what I have seen. So what is so amazing is the Holy Spirit can do more in one moment than we can seek to attain through all of our studies. And it's not either or at all. It's both and. But I can tell you, Jonathan, that I went through doubt so deep as a pastor and an apologist that I didn't want to be alive. I was thinking about what it would look like to end my life. I felt so hopeless. I felt like I was hanging by a string. It was horrible. And it wasn't horrible because I didn't believe it. It was so horrible because the thing that I believed the most, now I was questioning it so deeply. And if anyone's ever went from being a passionate Christian to struggling with doubts, when you feel so in love with God, now you're questioning it, you can start feeling like, well, what's wrong with me? And for me, I look at it and I think the Holy Spirit allowed me to go through a deep, dark night of the soul in order to prepare me to know how to talk about doubt out loud. Sadly, Jonathan, many people in the church, they're not prepared as pastors to deal with doubters, or we shame people who have doubters, or shame people who have doubts. And I don't celebrate doubt, but if people have doubt, we need to be able to talk about it because we see that it's not absent in the scriptures, and doubt is not a Christian problem. It's a human problem. In the absentee of certainty, there will always be room for doubt. The question is, which worldview best closes the doubt gap? And so I believe that Christianity provides robust answers, yet I still have questions as a Christian. But in my doubts, I entertain what it would look like to walk into a different worldview. And I started to premeditate on what questions I would have as an atheist and what questions I would have as a polytheist, what questions I would have as an agnostic. And what I ended up coming to believe is that so often we as Christians are on the defense of giving our apologetic, but if we can just spend more time thinking about what questions others have, then we can begin to let them know, hey, we're not alone here with questions. You have questions as well. And I'd say, Jonathan, through that doubt, a book came out of it called Doubting Toward Faith, where I talk about my doubts. I talk about some of the common things that cause doubts for people. I talk about what it was like to struggle with doubts as an apologist and as a pastor. And I distinguish between sincere doubt and skeptical doubt. There are those like that were part of like the emergent church movement who I would describe as skeptical doubters. See, some people want to doubt to move beyond their faith, but some people have doubts and they want to deal with them to move deeper into their faith. And Jesus can discern the difference between a skeptical doubter and a sincere doubter. Take John the Baptist. Isn't it amazing? John the Baptist, he's the cousin of Jesus. He baptizes Jesus. He says, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He's bold as can be, yet all of a sudden he's on death row and he starts struggling with doubts. And we can learn so much from the way that John dealt with his doubts. First of all, we learn it's easy to be bold when our head's not about to be on the chopping block. So he starts having these doubts. And what does he do? He sends his disciples off with his doubts. Now imagine that. His disciples are like, wait a second, you want us to go find out if Jesus is the Messiah? John, we're your disciples because you told us he was the Messiah. Now you want us to go double check on that, do some fact checking? Now, that tells us something very insightful. First of all, it tells us that John, as a leader to his disciples, was a vulnerable leader. He was vulnerable enough to reveal his own doubts to his disciples. And that takes courage. And I found comfort in that, realizing that as a pastor, that the flock needs to hear that I don't have it all together, that I too struggle with doubts, that I too have my questions. Not only that, what ends up happening is that they go off and they go to Jesus and they say, Jesus, hey, John wants to know if you're really the one. And Jesus says what? He doesn't freak out. He doesn't panic. He doesn't criticize John. He says, go tell John that the blind see, that the deaf hear, that, right, the lame can walk. Well, what's going on about that? Well, this is interesting. Jesus is operating like a great evidentialist. He's operating like a great apologist. He's utilizing the Old Testament the Hebrew scriptures and saying all the things that it prophesied about the Messiah and what he would do is happening through me right now. And so the disciples would go back, they would tell John, we don't know about the rest of the story. And by the way, won't that be great in heaven someday, Jonathan? All of the rest of the story. Like, how did that go down? Did they get back on time to tell John? All these extra elements, right? Like, I could just see getting into heaven someday and going into the movie theater of heaven and just Jesus pushing play on, here's all the little details that you always wanted to know. We're going to watch history from the beginning. We've got the time, and we're just going to spend several thousand years watching truth unfold. And when we're all finished with this, you'll be crystallized on what really went down. Well, don't quote me on that, but it's just a fun thought. So what does Jesus next say to the crowds? He says to the crowds, well, who did you go out to hear in the wilderness, right? Just this reed, blown and tossed by the wind? No. He says, behold, I tell you, no one has been born greater of a woman than John. What does Jesus do in that moment? He pays the greatest compliment in his earthly in his earthly ministry to the doubter. Why? Because he can discern the difference between skeptical doubt and sincere doubt. Jesus knew that John was scratching his head because, of course, the Jews thought Jesus was going to set up his kingdom. And he might have been thinking, what the heck am I doing here on death row if he's really the Messiah? And I love that about Jesus. And, we look in the scriptures and we just see that doubt is not foreign. And if John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus, could have doubts, how much more are we susceptible to doubt 2,000 years later with over 40,000 denominations and melting pot cultures of beliefs with tons of different doctrinal interpretations on everything? I mean, look, if the early church, if Peter could have his doubts apart from the New Testament, we live in a world where doubt is only progressing because we keep offering to the literature more interpretations that we got to hash through. That makes it very difficult for us. So if Adam and Eve could doubt in paradise, how much more are we susceptible to doubting in paradise lost? And I take comfort knowing that God can see us through. And Jonathan, literally, I went from a place of not even wanting to be alive to having my faith restored. And what I had to do is I had to renegotiate my faith stance. And I had to create a bigger box for me to live in. And I say it like this: some people want to be as conservative as they can be about their conservatism. I want to be as liberal as I can be about my conservatism without slipping into heresy. When you're as conservative as you can be about your conservatism, you'll inevitably alienate some who are in. But when you're as liberal as you can be about your conservatism without slipping into heresy, you'll be a welcoming Christian and you'll be able to live with those of different thoughts and perspectives. God brought me out about 3-4 years ago, and I've been doing great. And I no longer panic when I have questions, and I just enjoy the process. And I feel like on this side of my dark night of the soul, I'm able to talk to other people and feel more secure in my faith. And I think that I had to go through a necessary wounding in order to experience the wounded healer. Those are some thoughts, Jonathan.
Yeah, there's loads to discuss there. I think it's an important distinction to make between a doubt and a question. Right? We all have questions that we don't know the answer to this side of eternity, but that's not the same thing as a doubt, right? We all have questions about how to harmonize the sovereignty of God with human free will, for example. That's something which is a perplexing issue that theologians have battled over and discussed for millennia, and we're never going to have a full, complete picture explanation of that this side of eternity. But given that we have such good evidence that Christianity is true, that means that we can, be comfortable living with uncertainties and questions about the Christian faith. I think there's something that churches should teach more of is epistemology, the philosophical branch that deals with how we know what we know. Because I talk to a lot of people who are wrestling with doubts, people who are either thinking about giving up their faith or people who have given up their faith. And there's never one single issue. There's always a complexity of issues that are involved there. But there's one of the recurring patterns that I observe is that there's deficiencies in epistemology. So, for example, one common mistake is a failure to distinguish between an objection that's high stakes and an objection that's low stakes. So, for example, I've talked to a few people, for example, who struggle with doubts over the doctrine of eternal conscious torment in hell. And my question to them is, well, why didn't you become a conditionalist, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a defensible position, and as you know, there are good theologians, robust theologians who have taken that perspective, and I think that they have some plausible things to say. John Stott would be one, Glenn Andrew Peoples, Chris Date I've had on this show, and you've had him on your show as well. So there's as you mentioned, there's a variety of theological perspectives that are open to the Christian.
Right.
We shouldn't be so fixated on one particular interpretation that we and I think that's sometimes where, unfortunately, churches have done Christians a disservice in kind of selling their take on a particular issue of Christianity as Christianity itself. And I'm reading a book at the moment, actually, called, you might have read it, it's called A Recipe for Disaster. Do you know the book? Oh, okay.
No.
It just came out recently, late at the end of last year. And it's on Christians who have lost their faith. And it has studies of people like the triple jumper Jonathan Edwards and others who have lost their faith and some of the reasons behind that. And one of the there's a whole chapter on what he calls what was the phrase he used? The tyranny of the necessary, I think was the expression he used, which is to sell one's particular take on Christianity as Christianity itself. So, for example, young Earth creationism with the truth of Christianity, so that when someone starts to doubt young Earth creationism, rather than revising their theology, they discard Christianity in toto. And so I think, and one final point is another epistemological deficiency I often observe is that people will get so fixated on one objection, be it the problem of suffering or something, which are difficult questions, and they get so fixated on those issues that they miss the forest for the trees, and they miss the avalanche of positive confirmatory evidence because they're so fixated on this issue. So the question is not, are there objections to Christianity for which there are no satisfying answers? But the question is rather, are there more substantive and more numerous objections to believing the gospel or to not believing the gospel? And I'm convinced, having studied the evidences on both sides quite carefully, that yes, there are evidences against Christianity, but they're dwarfed by the evidences that are affirmatory of Christianity. Right. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I appreciate, number one, the telling me about that book. I looked it up here on Amazon. So I always like getting good book recommendations. I do think epistemology is something very helpful to equip people with in the church. I do think that I take comfort, Jonathan, in knowing that you don't have to be a genius, or you don't have to be a scholar, or you don't have to have gone to seminary to believe in the gospel. A little bit of reformed epistemology with planting I don't know what your thoughts would be on that, but I do think it's encouraging that someone, through the power of the Holy Spirit, can sense that they have encountered God. And that's comforting, because there's so many people that don't have the opportunity, say, that you and I have been given to study our PhD or what have you. but they believe deeply and they have a deep faith and they've been touched by the Holy Spirit. And yeah, when they speak about their faith, it's not always going to be as clean and tidy as we might like, but they've been touched by the Spirit of God and experienced encounters, forgiveness. And yes, they need discipleship. But I like knowing that God can meet babes, so to speak. He can meet the young ones and we can be discipled and we can grow. I think also in the church that we have to not be fearful of questions. And so to your point, as it relates to like a certain system setting people up to doubt, like young earthers, for example, that can be problematic, because now if indeed, let's say it's proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, and somebody like you or myself would feel like, well, the evidence is there that it looks old earth, right? Well, if you hold to a young earth so tightly that all of a sudden you believe that the universe is only 6 to 10,000 years old, well, it's going to be problematic, because you'll feel like you got to walk away from your faith on that. And to your point, there's broader interpretations. If somebody is struggling with eternal conscious torment, like you said, look at some of the stuff on conditionalism and realize that that is a viable approach. If you're struggling with the whole idea of young versus old earth, and you look at the science and you feel like it points toward old earth, it doesn't mean you have to throw out your faith. There's room for it there. And that's what I mean by, we can be more generous in the way that we look at this. And I think that we have to be gracious with each other too, Jonathan, because so often we're in the apologetic circles looking to criticize each other over these different viewpoints. And we need to be aligned with each other. Our battle is not against one another in one another's theological nuances. We just need to be gracious toward each other. Uh, look at the difference it would make if we would think about somebody holding a different position to me, to realize, well, what if that person was mentored by somebody that had that position, that was introduced to certain books with that position, and that's really all they know, and their context, their experiences, their books, everything that they've done, it's come along for them to arrive at that position. Well, we can't pound them and assume they should have had our same experience. We need to be more gracious with one another. And I sometimes am disturbed, Jonathan, when I read stuff online. I'm sure you are too. When you see some of the Christians dialoguing with one another, it feels like we're in a fight with each other to get people to believe in our own doctrinal viewpoints. And I think that sometimes non-believers can see that and they can think, I don't want to join that battle. That looks like a disaster. And I think that if we could spend more time talking about what kind of a conversation do we have to have internally that doesn't send mixed messages to those who are exploring our faith, I think that would go a long ways in letting people know that, wow, I can walk into this and I'm not going to be beat up if I don't take this position versus this position. Does that make sense? Jonathan, I don't have your sound here.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, there we go. No problem.
Yes, I completely 100% agree. Very well put. Do you want to talk about, actually, we've got a hand raised. Let's go to a question from a caller, and then I'll ask you some more stuff.
They're raising their hand. Very good. Good manners.
All right. So we have Kevin Ross.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. How are you?
Okay, I'm doing well. Thanks a lot, Jonathan, for having this this topic. I think it's a great topic. And I want to thank you, Bobby, for your book, because it's been very helpful for me personally. And we've actually used this in my Ratio Christi chapter at Auburn University. And I want to kind of draw out a distinction that you kind of pointed to, and that is the distinction between sincere doubt and skeptical doubt. I've kind of looked at it a little bit differently. I mean, I definitely see what you're talking about, but I think of doubt in terms of two things, really: uncertainty of knowledge in general, and also the issue of trust. And so, in on one hand, you know, what a lot of people deal with on a regular basis, which I think epistemology helps with, is just the question of uncertainty and what it means as a human problem, as a human being, to live with uncertainty. And I think Christians can help people with that. But the bigger issue that I see is when that kind of uncertainty metastasizes and starts to bleed over into the question of trust for a believer. If you trust for God and your trust of Scripture, and to me, it seems like the real issue, the dangerous issue for the believer is, you know, how do you guard your trust? What can you add anything, or maybe clarify a little bit on that distinction?
I think it's a good distinction. I would say, let's take John the Baptist. Perhaps if we're using the sincere versus skeptical kind of doubt that I'm talking about, I could see myself being comfortable looking at John the Baptist as he's having some uncertainty, and that uncertainty would be sincere. But it is uncertain, and it feels like doubt, and he wants some clarity there. I think that when it shifts into the trust, then now we're starting to get skeptical. And so I think that the way you worded it, those would be two terms that I would be comfortable pairing with the skeptical versus sincere. When I'm starting to really struggle with trust, now I'm getting skeptical. When I'm uncertain, I can be sincere in my uncertainty, but still trust that there is an answer. And so maybe that's one way of putting this together, just as I'm speaking ad lib.
Sure. And let me just ask one more question about this.
Yeah.
I think it kind of relates to it. And that is, I'm not a New Testament student. I'm not a student of the languages. And so I know in the New Testament, the word doubt is actually translates several different words, Greek words. And I'm just kind of wondering if, you know, I haven't looked at this in quite a while, but
Yeah.
so there's, like in James, where it talks about people who doubt,
Yeah.
you know, being unstable. And, you know, the question is, I guess the word doubt there, that obviously is something which the Bible is warning us against, or like in Romans, we're being warned against doubt. But I feel, or I think that needs to be clearly distinguished between the ordinary kind of doubt, which is just questioning and not being sure about things. And does the New Testament really make that distinction? The way that it uses its language?
Yeah, that's a good point. So for me, I was influenced by Os Guinness when I was in the midst of my doubts. Is it Kevin I'm talking to?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
When
right.
I was struggling with my doubts, Kevin, Os Guinness's books were really helpful to me on that. And he talked about how doubt, coming from the Latin word dubitare, meaning to be in two minds, and then correlated it to in James 1, where it says the double-minded man is unstable in all that he does. And that is the premise there in James 1. And that is where I built it out from, looking at doubt as being in two minds. So in my book, Doubting Toward Faith, that's what I'm trying to say is, one, that to be in a place of doubt is to be in two minds. It splits the mind, and you can either doubt toward unbelief, or you could doubt toward faith, or you could doubt toward trust. You can't always stay in that state of two minds. And so that's how I took it and worked with it, instead of trying to figure out all the different nuances that it could be used, and playing with a different one. I just went with that one way in which it is used in the context of James 1, in order to develop a way to doubt toward faith. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, you bet, Kevin. Thank you for your questions.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. Another epistemic issue that I sometimes discuss is the value in Christianity of having multiple varied types of evidence, that we don't just have evidences that are fundamentally of the same kind, but we have so many varied types of evidences. And so when we're dealing with doubts like say the problem of evil or the problem of suffering, that's each of these. So if someone's to make a cumulative case from the instances of apparently needless suffering or evil in the world, these are evidences of the same fundamental kind, or the same type of evidence. So if God has some morally sufficient reason for permitting one instance of evil and suffering in the world, he might well have a similar morally sufficient explanation for permitting the second piece and the third piece of suffering, and so on. Whereas with Christianity, what is wonderful about the evidence is that it's not only extensive but also varied in kind. So we have lots of different categories of evidence, and so that's also another epistemic thing that I think people need to bear in mind when sifting through the different evidences and counter evidences as they wrestle with their doubts. Do you have anything to say on that?
Well, you know what? I wanted to ask you that, Jonathan. So, I mean, what are some thoughts that you would have as it relates maybe to even New Testament studies, some of the different types of evidences that you feel like can be helpful to a student? So suppose somebody's looking at apparent contradictions and they're really beginning to struggle with harmonizing something. What kind of a process would you encourage somebody to go through, Jonathan, that would allow someone to go, hey, here's a possible way to harmonize this particular text, and here are some different approaches you can take to realize that you aren't, out of your mind to believe this?
Absolutely. So the first piece of advice is that I would encourage people to read the text for themselves. I've worked through all of Bart Ehrman's alleged contradictions in the New Testament, plus lots of other ones that he doesn't bring up as well. And every single one that Bart Ehrman brings up in his Jesus Interrupted turns out to fail as an alleged contradiction. And I'm not exaggerating there. I have gone through every single one of his alleged contradictions. And I don't think any of them are convincing when one reads the text for themselves. Some of them fall apart just on a very quick reading of the text. Now, I have 9 different categories of evidences that I use to establish the substantial reliability of the Gospels in Acts. One of those categories of evidence is called reconcilable variations. And this is to establish independence of the accounts. So to define a reconcilable, I'll give it an example. A reconcilable variation occurs when you have 2 or more accounts of an event which seem at first blush to be in tension with one another, even to the point of appearing unharmonizable. And then upon further inspection or upon learning some new information, it turns out they fit together in some very obvious way after all. And so it supports the independence of the accounts. The one's not using the other as a source, right? So I'll give an example to help illustrate this. So if you imagine one of the contradictions that Bart Ehrman brings up in Jesus Interrupted and in his lectures as well is the alleged discrepancy concerning the discovery of the empty tomb. When the women come to discover the empty tomb, in all 3 of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have multiple women going to the tomb on Easter morning, right? You have Mary Magdalene, you have Mary the mother of Jesus, you have Salome, etc. Now, when you go over to John 20 and verse 1, Bart Ehrman uses this as an alleged contradiction in the Gospels. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Oh, Bart Ehrman says, so how many women were at the tomb? Well, it depends which Gospel you read, as Bart Ehrman.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is interesting is, yes, it appears on first blush to be a discrepancy between the accounts, but then read the next verse. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we, plural, do not know where they have laid him. So then she indicates to us that actually there were other women with her at the tomb, but that just drop of the plural pronoun. So even though John's not explicit that there were other women, it shows that there in fact were other women at the tomb. And so it points to the independence of these narratives concerning the empty tomb discovery. And so that's an example of a reconcilable variation. So I actually use alleged discrepancies between the accounts and turn them on their head to build a positive confirmatory argument for the substantial reliability of the Gospels.
So Jonathan, just as a question to follow up with that, because maybe some of the audience that's listening right now, with these 9 different lines of evidence that you offer for how, there's different lines of evidence, have you produced any articles online anywhere that people can go? And is there a future project in the making of taking some of Bart Ehrman's stuff and offering sort of a rebuttal to that that you want to get in the hands of people? Or is it just stuff that you're just passionate about and you just do for fun, like you do playing chess without looking at a chessboard and just memorizing the board because your brain works that way?
I haven't. I've written bits and pieces on it all over the place. I haven't written the about the 9 categories in some systematic way. I mean, I'm not the first to come up with them. I mean, there's you can find them individually spoken of in different authors. Undesigned coincidences, for example, is one of my 9 categories. I also use what I call unexplained allusions, which is where you have a little incidental extraneous details which appear to be unnecessary and superfluous. If you're making up a story, obviously you want to minimize unnecessary details. Just one quick example of that, if you look at Mark 15, where you have Jesus carrying the cross to his execution site at Golgotha. Verse 21, they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene. He was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. Well, who are Alexander and Rufus, right? The Gospels don't tell us. Its own, but they seem to have been known to the original audience. Otherwise, Mark wouldn't name drop them like that. But that's a hallmark of truth, right? It points to the truth of the narrative. It's something that's very surprising in a fictitious work, but something that's quite unsurprising if this is a work of history. That makes sense? So that's another category of evidence I use.
You know what's interesting too is it's just taking time with the text. I forget which one of the 4 Gospels, but in one of the 4 Gospels, it says that, and those who were crucified with him, chided him. And you sit there and you go, wait a second, both thieves in one of the accounts are mocking Jesus. Well, I thought one of them is saying, hey, teacher, remember me today, and the way that can be harmonized is, yes, at first both were, giving him a hard time, but then what does Jesus do? Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. So it's very plausible to see how that one thief on the cross became convicted by the Holy Spirit at his actions, thinking, hey, this man hasn't done anything wrong. And look, he's asking for forgiveness. Perhaps he reasoned in his heart and he says, hey, remember me. And so that's a neat concept, because 3 of the 4 Gospels have them both chiding, or they have just the one chiding, but then in one, they're both doing it. So how do you get around that? Well, perhaps he realized this person is innocent and I need him as my savior. Remember me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very good. Um, yeah, the variations between the gospel accounts, I think, is no evidence against um, the truthfulness of the accounts, but evidence for it. In fact, there's several arguments, actually quite a number of objections to the Gospels and Acts, which I think turn out to be evidences for the reliability of the Gospels and Acts rather than against them. Just a quick example, in Mark chapter 10, you have Jesus giving teaching on divorce, and it says, so in verse 10, in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter, and he said to them, so he's now repeating himself, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery, right? Now this is an objection to the Gospels, because critics come along and they say, aha, Jewish law, yes, it made provision for a man to divorce his wife, but it made no provision for a woman to divorce her husband. And so they argue that this here is an evidence that Mark was perhaps a Gentile who betrays his ignorance of Jewish law, perhaps even is fixing Jesus' teaching to make it suitable for a Gentile audience. But it turns out, interestingly, Josephus fills us in some of the backstory here, that he speaks about Herod Antipas had divorced his wife to marry Herodias, and Herodias had divorced, and he says that Herodias took it upon herself to confound the laws of her country, and divorced her first husband, who was Philip, Herod's brother, in order to marry Herod Antipas. So Herodias had divorced Philip to marry Herod Antipas, even though it was illegal in Jewish law. And where was Herod Antipas tetrarch? He was tetrarch of Galilee, the very place where Jesus is giving this teaching. Right? So all the pieces just fit together in a way that points to the truth of the narrative. And so instead of being an objection against the Gospels, it turns out to be an argument for the Gospels.
Yeah, Jonathan, that's the kind of stuff that I think we just have to take our time, because putting it all together, and part of the danger I think comes is when we try to impose a 21st century mindset on an ancient day milieu, and we expect them to have the same reporting methods as maybe our journalists today. And even taking, for example, one of the things that caused me a lot of distress for my own doubts, Jonathan, was the Buzard culture of the ancient Near East. So I would be reading my Bible and I would think, this is so bizarre. And I think it's hard for us to relate in this age of modernity, where science and empiricism is at the forefront. It's hard to relate to some of these bizarre passages of scripture in the Old Testament in particular. So I would find myself just scratching my head, reading my Bible, going, I can't relate. And I think one of the things that began to help me is to realize that I can't impose my contemporary understanding on an ancient world. I got to realize that God was meeting people in their own milieu. So take, for example, and I talk about this in Doubting Toward Faith, the story with Abraham and Isaac. We know that God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans in southern Mesopotamia, and he was promised as Abram that he would become the father of many nations. Therefore, he becomes Abraham, and he's waiting, right? He's waiting for his promised child. He gets this promise that through him, all nations are going to be blessed. Well, we know he gets impatient, and he goes down to Egypt and gets Hagar, and Sarah says, hey, take Hagar. So, we're waiting on God. The promise isn't happening, so they want to help God out, and Ishmael comes on the scenes. And we know that Islam traces back their lineage to Ishmael. You think about, wow, the consequences of not waiting on God, not being more patient. We have Islam, right? And so now he seeks to have relations with Hagar because of Sarah's request. Ishmael's born. And then years go by, and finally he learns that in his old age and in Sarah's old age, that the promised child's going to come. They waited 25 years. Isaac's born. Now, wait a second. Isaac's born, and now he's told, go and bring him up to Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice. Now you got to scratch your head and think, wait a second. Why would God ask him to do that? And so Larry King, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He had a program for many years in the United States called Larry King Live. And all of his guests that would come on that were like Christians or Jews, he would say, I cannot believe in a God who would ask for a father to sacrifice his son. And he said, I've never heard a satisfactory answer. And he struggled with that passage. And the truth is, when we think about that passage, pastors, if they get up and preach, you go, oh, look at Abraham's faith, how great he is. He went to sacrifice his son. Well, that just sounds bizarre. Like if somebody came to me and said, you know what, God told me to sacrifice my son, I'd have him arrested. I'd think, what is wrong with you? So yes, from our context, but let's think about the context that Abraham was called out of as Abram. He was called out of a context whereby child sacrifice was the norm. And child sacrifice in the Chaldean culture was the greatest way one could exhibit their faith in their perceived gods that they believed in. So now, what does God do? He gives them an opportunity to basically believe he's exercising his faith at the highest level. But then when it comes time for him to sacrifice his son Isaac, he says, stop, as if to say, I am not like the other gods. I will provide the sacrifice. So the whole story is meant to show that God does not desire child sacrifice. And the only sacrifice of a child would be God giving his own son someday. And then why did Abraham even attempt to do this? Because Hebrews tells us that he believed so deeply in God that he believed that God could raise him from the dead. Now, why is that? Well, because if God could give him and Sarah, Isaac, in late age, and he could work that miracle, then he can raise this child from the dead. And so I just say that all of a sudden, when we take time to understand the milieu and the context, that can comfort us. So take another example, like the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis 6. That passage is so bizarre. I remember Jonathan teaching that passage. I was teaching through the book of Genesis. I did it for 2 years, unpacking the series. I titled the series, Blessed Though Cursed. And when I came to Genesis 6, I found myself preparing my talk going, how do I preach this passage? And I just found myself scratching my head going, God, this is bizarre. And I just felt that this is odd. Like the sons of God, who are the sons of God coming down, sleeping with the daughters of men? So the introduction to my text that day, I got up and I said, have any of you ever read your Bible and just found yourself reading it and struggling to relate to it and feeling like you were so far removed from this context? Well, today we're coming to a passage in Genesis 6, and it is a bizarre text. It is so bizarre. I found myself scratching my head in my preparations of how am I supposed to teach this passage. In fact, I wanted to skip over this passage. In fact, I wish this passage wasn't even in the Bible. I didn't even know what to do with this passage. But today, can I tell you that I want to talk with you how I came to see that this passage is bizarre, but how I came to also see it is true. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 6. Well, in that moment, I had them realizing that they can relate to me. Instead of just getting up and starting with giving a defense, I let them feel my own tension. And I think as apologists, we need to do a better job of letting people know the tensions that we feel. So we often end up meeting our audience at the conclusions we made. And I think if we're going to endear them to us, we need to meet them with the process we went through and the torments we went through to come to that conclusion. And that brings them along to us. It lets them learn about our journey. And so then what I just basically did is I taught about that passage and I said, you know, it's interesting. To the original audience, say that Moses was writing to, that passage, there's so little said. So it's obvious that he's assuming his original audience knew the details that create the questions that we sit around and ask all these years later, like who the sons of God are and who the daughters of men are and what all this produced, that was obvious to the original audience. And so we're stuck with just this small little pericope, this small summary passage, and we start asking hundreds of questions around it. And I just take comfort going, wow, this was obviously assumed. It was no big deal, but he wasn't writing from the standpoint of thinking about us all these years later that didn't have the understanding that they did. So there's some things that seem bizarre to us because we don't get a lot of context, but it was assumed in that original context. Does that make sense, Jonathan?
Yes, it does. Yeah, that was. We have a few people wanting to ask questions.
Great.
Kim is my fiance, Katerina.
There she is.
I was just wondering if you've got experience in counseling people who experience a different kind of doubt, not a doubt of an intellectual kind, but a doubt of a more emotional nature, where they just feel distant from God and they don't experience him in a way they might used to experience him before, and that then brings them to doubt their belief.
Yeah, that's a good question because it really brings up a pastoral element to our journey. And when we think about our walk with God and we think about the journeys that we go on, there are these kind of different levels that we go into. There's the honeymoon stage, right? When we believe. And really, when we look at Acts chapter 2, we're seeing a honeymoon stage of belief. It's basically, when we look at Acts 2, that's new conversion passion. And when we often look at that and think, oh, I want to experience Acts chapter 2. Well, a new convert does experience Acts chapter 2. That's sold out, ready to live, ready to follow, passionate kind of Christianity. And we even think about Peter, who would have been there. He had all that passion. But isn't it interesting that Peter would go on in Acts chapter 10? He has this vision of, the animals kind of floating down, and don't call unclean what I've called clean. And he realizes that the gospel's for both Jew and Gentiles, but then later on, Paul would rebuke him for separating from the Gentiles. So in other words, his fire was beginning to cool off, even through the process of reading the scriptures. And I think that that's just the normal Christian life. So we start off on fire and call that the passionate stage, the new conversion stage, the honeymoon stage. And what happens is we end up getting a part of a church, and then there's kind of this discipleship stage. And this is where we get indoctrinated and we are handed a set of beliefs. And what happens is we get handed a set of beliefs, so we're getting indoctrinated. And I think the set of beliefs we get can often lead to an overconfident black and white self-righteous stage where now we're argumentative, we're a little rigid as new believers. We've read the Left Behind series and we know how the world's going to wrap up, and we're out there hammering people with the pre-trib view, so to speak, and we come off a little rigid, self-righteous, overly black and white. And then what ends up happening is we can slip into a dark night of the soul. This is a stage that's got angst, confusion. We're groping, we're reaching for God. We're wondering what happened to that passion. And now what's happening at this stage of our sanctification is now we're not overly black and white. Now things feel gray. It's a storm, dark night of the soul. Now we're questioning the things that we were so confident about in that second stage. So that first stage, honeymoon stage, that second stage, thinking we have each other all figured out, thinking we've got God in a box. That third stage, the storm comes, the romance dies, we wonder where God is, existential angst, we're confused. Now we're wondering, do we want to stay in this relationship? Why do we want to be in something where we don't feel God's presence? Where are you, God? And this is really where we have to renegotiate our faith stance, where we have to understand our relationship with God. And this is where the church does a disservice, where we walk around saying, oh, isn't prayer amazing? Isn't prayer great? Can't you feel his presence? Because what we end up doing is we set people up for disillusionment when we make them think that prayer is always going to be unbelievable. See, when I ask my wife out on a date, she always shows up. But when I go into a quiet time to have a date with Jesus, I don't always sense him there. And that's because there's not a one-to-one correspondence to the way that God does relationship with us and the way that we do community with one another. So we have to renegotiate our faith stance in the dark night of the soul. And so what happens is we're overconfident when we get quickly indoctrinated, and that's met with pride. But the dark night of the soul re-humbles us. See, we come into faith at stage 1 through humility, having faith like a child, realizing, God, I need you. I can't live without you. And the dark night of the soul re-humbles us. And we realize that I can't master God. I can't put him in a box. And it's there that we realize that I'm going to love him even if I can't feel him. I'm going to trust him. And what happens is we renegotiate our faith stance. We become like a little child again. We enter into the next stage the same way we entered in the first stage, by realizing we don't have all the answers. We embrace mystery. And for me, my renegotiation was I'm going to love God, love people, and celebrate the gospel. And God brought me out of the dark night of the soul. And then in that next stage, we have some answers, but we embrace gray. We have confidence, but we have humility. There's black and white on the macro doctrines that God created us. The resurrection happened, but we're now okay with his distance. And we're more amicable toward others. We're more into mere Christianity instead of trying to master Christianity. And we're at rest in our soul. And once in a while, God in his goodness pays us a spiritual visit where we sense his presence in a peaceful way. But at this stage, we no longer panic when it goes away. We take it for what it is, that every now and then God lets us know in an intimate way he's still there. And it's usually in a deep state of suffering when we sense him, or we're in desperate need of Holy Spirit direction for a major decision, like, should I marry this person? Should I move to this place? Those are the moments where, even in the scripture, where God seems to meet us. And in the regular day in and day out stuff, he wants us to know that when we do not know the way forward, when we can't see through the windshield the way forward, we navigate forward. We doubt toward faith by looking through the rearview mirror of all the moments that he has sovereignly and providentially guided us in the past. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, you bet.
All right, we have a couple other hands raised, and let's go to Pixel. Let me bring her up. Hey.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, thank you for setting up this call. I'm finding it really, really useful, and I would love to have 5 hours just talking to Bobby, because I feel that Bobby really has a clear understanding of what it means to doubt and what it means to wrestle with faith. So thank you. So I guess my question is around, I've got a couple of questions. I think I'll try and find a way to phrase my questions. I think the first one is, so I've been struggling with doubt for a very long time, maybe 5 years, 6 years. And I'm trying to find what kind of practical things I can do that can just help me get through, like help me to keep hanging on to my faith, because I've been doing apologetics for a very long time, maybe 10 years or so, and so I kind of know all the intellectual answers, but I think there comes a time when they're no longer enough, because they're just not really, I think obviously like what Katerina said, they're not really satisfying you emotionally. So I already know all the arguments and things like that, but it's just not enough. And I think so one example is when you read about God's goodness and his love and his desire to have a relationship with you, when you read about that in the Bible and you can't reconcile that to your experience and it goes on for a prolonged period of time, I think you can end up in quite a dangerous spot where you're just kind of, you can end up a little bit kind of nihilistic in your thinking. Especially for me, where I've based my entire kind of existence on Christianity. And now I've come to a point where I'm thinking, oh gosh, like, is it true? And if it is true, what kind of God am I serving? So I'm just thinking, what kind of, I guess, practical things to do to hang on until something happens that just aren't around knowing what all the intellectual kind of, all the objective arguments are.
Yeah. Is it Pixel?
Yes.
Yeah, I love that name. Okay, that's a great name, Pixel.
It's the name of my phone. I just didn't bother to update the name.
No, that's good. So I would say a couple of things to that. Number one, at the 1minuteapologist.com, if you go there, you can become a team member. And by becoming a team member, we'll be doing monthly Zoom sessions, and we're going to be talking about doubt and stuff like this, even from a pastoral standpoint for team members. And that's one of the things that we're going to be offering those who are team members at the 1minuteapologist.com. So that's one way if you wanted to keep the conversation going with us. I feel like as it relates to a process, you're right. Apologetics won't always help a particular type of person. For example, I am very right-brained as well as left-brained. And the left brain is the logical, the analytical. The right brain is the creative. It's the out of the box. It's the artsy side. And some of that can create a very disturbed soul. For example, my life, I've struggled with alcohol and drug addiction. I know what it's like to struggle with horrific anxieties, a deep, dark depression, doubts. And I believe a lot of that has been in part because of how my right brain works. And if you think about like a lot of people who have struggled with your deep anxiety and deep depression and drug addiction and alcoholism, they're often your artists and your musicians and your actors. They're your right brain people. And why is that? Well, it's because that part of the brain influences the emotions very deeply. And so those who are more left-brained and they don't have a lot of pressure from the right side of their brain mounting their emotions with attacks, what ends up happening is they're able to analyze and they're able to remain critical, but they don't end up panicking and feeling existential angst. So you think about a guy like Soren Kierkegaard, who was somebody, the Danish philosopher in the mid-19th century. He wrote the concept of anxiety. He was a bizarre individual, brilliant, um, but he struggled deeply with his anxieties and his depressions. And he came from a family, his father did as well. And you think about his creative style of writing, or take, for example, Charles Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers in the 19th century. You see his poetic style. He's very right-brained, and he struggled with depressions and even doubts. His deacon had to take him out of town often to spend a weekend because he would just be withered, being racked by his faith. And I think a lot of that was informed by the right side of his brain. So why am I saying all of this, Pixel? Because I think a lot of apologists are left-brained and they are not always speaking to the language of the heart of those who are more right-brained. And those who see, if somebody is just left brain and they just look for answers and they don't get all the answers they want, they might go ahead and walk out and just and just leave the whole thing and say, forget about it, I don't believe any longer. But those who are also right brain, they'll go through it and they'll experience their doubts in an existential, deep, emotional, panicky kind of way. And so what I talk about in my book, Doubting Toward Faith, is I say, I believe the worst type of doubter is the person who's what I call the obsessive analyzer. See, you can obsess, but not analyze. You can have OCD tendencies, but you might not be obsessing on questions about the faith. You might be obsessing on porn. You might be obsessing on gambling. You might be obsessing on, something different. You might have just taken your faith and went with it and obsessing in another area. But there are analyzers who analyze their faith. Like, I think Jonathan is a classic analyzer. He analyzes deeply. He's brilliant. He thinks about things very, very deeply. But what happens when you have an obsessive analyzer, somebody who analyzes about their faith, but they do so in an obsessive way? So take William Lane Craig, the great apologist, philosopher. I think he is an analyzer, but he doesn't obsess on his analyzing. So he can work a hard day, and at night he can go out on a date and he can remove himself from analyzing. The obsessive analyzer, their whole life becomes entrenched in it. And so when I think about my own life as an alcoholic, addict personality, anxious, depressed, OCD tendencies, and you wrap that with this highly analytical mind, I think what happens then is this can become sort of a recipe for a disordered relationship with God. And so I would say there's a way that that person has to deal with their doubts to walk out of it. And so for me, what I also realized is that there is an element where I had to learn how to unlock. There's more to life than just thinking about the doctrinal positions that we hold. And if you're an analyzer, but not an obsessor, you can go out and play volleyball, you can go to the gym, you can remove yourself from those things. But the obsessive side, it will begin to overwhelm your life and you have to know how to remove it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. I really like that. That's such a it's such a good perspective. Yeah, it really, really resonates with me. So thank you.
Yeah, so some of the practical things then, as I would just say, number one, identify the types of doubts that like if you were to get out a blank sheet of paper and go, I'm going to write out my doubts. So just write out all the different questions or the doubts that you have. Then group those micro doubts into macro categories. And then once you figure out, you don't have thousands of doubts, you just got, a bunch of doubts that fall under certain categories, like the problem of evil, or the existence of God, or apparent contradictions. Then lump all of those under macro categories. Then ask the question of those categories, where do you feel the most amount of doubt and pressure? And then ask, well, why? Can I read some more books? Is that really the solution? And sometimes it's really just a matter of, again, what I said, you become a Christian, then you'll read the Bible to learn about your Christianity, then you'll learn theology to learn about your Bible, then you'll learn apologetics to learn about your theology, then you'll move into philosophy to learn about your apologetics. But then somewhere along the line, we have to come back to just renegotiating our faith stance, becoming like a little child again, realizing that there's more to life. Look, we can spend the rest of our life turning questions. Eventually, we have to go live this thing. We have to come to some conclusions on some things. And we have to realize that God knows that we can't spend our entire life reading book after book after book after book. With the reading and writing of books, right? The Solomon or the Koheleth of Ecclesiastes says there's no end. Eventually, we got to get out and love people. Eventually, we got to get out and enjoy our spouse. Eventually, we got to raise kids. So we have to know that there's only so much time we can give to this project of learning. And with much learning, there's no end as finite creatures. And we have to just make a decision to realize that if Jesus rose from the dead, and that was it for me. Pixel, I came to believe that I tried to explain the resurrection away in the midst of my doubts, and I couldn't do it. And so I thought, if Jesus rose from the dead, then he really did die. And if he really did die, he really did live. And if he really did live, while he lived, he really did say that he was going to die and rise again. And so, if he really did live, he really was incarnated. And if he really was incarnated, he really was the second person of the Trinity. And so, it all rises and falls on that. And so, I felt like I could quiet my question quest by realizing that if he rose from the grave, that settles it. And now I'll learn in a non-obsessive way.
That's really helpful. Thank you. That's great. I had one more question. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. So the second question was, obviously, as a Christian, I've been a Christian all my life, so I know that part of being a Christian is sharing the gospel. And, part of the Great Commission is to go out and share the gospel. I think if you have huge kind of nagging doubts, I think it can be difficult to then be in a position to share the gospel with joy. So I wonder what you do, like, whilst you're kind of working things out in your head. Can you carry on sharing the gospel honestly, or do you have to almost just take a break and just maybe hang on to like one thing? I don't know, but I guess what I'm saying is obviously it's related to your answer, because you said that obviously don't obsess about your doubts, and you have to kind of get to a point where you can grow out of it. But I think for me, one kind of guilt I struggle with is that I can't really spread and evangelize as I would want to, because I've got all these kind of issues in my head. And I'll just give you one example. So I was watching a talk between Sam Harris and what's his name, Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
So they did this 3-hour debates in Canada and Ireland and some other places. And there's a part where Sam Harris says why it seems as though if you have to do thousands of mental gymnastics to make your faith work, then, you know, there's something wrong with it. And yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. So if you feel like you have to do all this stuff just to make it fit, and if it's not sort of, if you're not experiencing it the way the Bible kind of suggests you should. So the Bible says, you know, I've come to give you life in all its fullness, and talks about the abundant life. If you're not really experiencing that, and then you're having to do all these mental gymnastics to try and make it work and to try and get other people to believe it, then I don't know, what do you do with that?
Yeah. Well, that tells me a little bit about the depth of your doubts. And I appreciate you sharing that, because I can sympathize and empathize with that question. I'd say a couple things. Number one, as it relates working backwards with Sam Harris, mental gymnastics, I can understand how he could say a statement like that. And that's one of the reasons why we have to simplify this thing, because so often that's what we begin to think discipleship is. There was a time I thought a mature Christian is one who knows how to give a bunch of answers on everything. And really, I think Jesus would say a mature Christian is one who loves God with all their heart, soul, strength, and mind, and loves their neighbor as themselves, and then celebrates the gospel. And so, again, that's what's so beautiful. Jesus was trying to simplify what the Jews had so complicated, right? I mean, he was breaking their categories down. He was healing people on the Sabbath. You know, he took the whole law and says, look, I've come to fulfill it. And in coming to fulfill it, what's he saying? Hey, instead of sitting around and trying to figure out all the different moral particularities, I am your moral exemplar. Look at me. I'm who you're following. It's a relationship. And then he takes the whole law, and what does he do? He reduces it and he simplifies it. He says, hey, love God with all your heart, soul, strength, mind. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? He simplifies this whole thing. And out of the great commandment, when we focus on that, then flows the Great Commission. The Great Commission flows out of a great commandment and a heart to living that kind of a lifestyle. And so, in the same way that the Jews overly complicated their Judaism, I believe that Christians have overcomplicated their Christianity. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't study, we shouldn't learn. Not that at all. I love studying, I love learning. But just as Alvin Plantinga, with this whole idea of reformed epistemology, talks about how one can still have a properly basic belief of believing in what he believes to be true, even though it looks like the evidence is stacked up against him. And he gives the example of like a person in a court of law, and he's being accused of being guilty. And in his heart, he knows he's innocent, but all the evidence looks like it's against him. Yet he knows deep down he did not commit the crime that he's being accused of. In the same way, a Christian who's never went on the adventure of trying to figure out all the gymnastics of how this whole thing works, through the Holy Spirit can know that this is true, even though they're being buffeted by questions that look like it might be false. So if Christianity, in other words, is true, it really is true. So I would say, Pixel, I felt that deeply as a pastor. Can you imagine what it would be like to be a lead pastor of a church and to be an apologist with a national platform and having to get up every Sunday and going through these doubts? How I did that, it was horrible. I felt, boy, am I a hypocrite? And I had to come to a place where I had to distinguish that, you know what, sometimes the evil one's planting thoughts in my mind saying, look at you, you're a hypocrite. Look at you, you don't really believe this. And I had to remind myself, but God, I want to believe this. And God, you know my heart. And so how was I preaching? I was truly preaching by faith. I would say, God, I can remember, Pixel, going out preaching, saying, God, my brain's racked with questions I cannot answer, but by faith from my heart, I'm just going to preach and trust. And you know what God will do then to a heart like yours, Pixel? He'll help you to be a humble ambassador. So when you're sharing the gospel, and when I'm sharing the gospel with somebody, I can say things like, hey, I don't have all the answers here. I'm not claiming I do. I just believe that Jesus rose from the grave, and you could have all kinds of questions that could hammer me. And I would say, just share your own doubts, but share that you trust the resurrection, and say, you can believe on the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ too, and you can bring your questions to the cross and go out. I would say simplify your faith a little bit and renegotiate your faith stance, and realize that you can share the gospel by faith, and realize that Sam Harris has to do his own gymnastics. Don't let him believe you to think he doesn't. With his moral landscape, he's trying to claim that there is objective morality on naturalism. I tell you, that takes a lot more gymnastics to prove than it does to believe that there is moral realism or objective morality on theism. So he says these statements that we can often feel shooken up because he says it with such authority. Well, I don't think he realizes that he's got a lot of faith to believe that nothing took nothing and made all of this. I think that he believes in a bigger miracle than I do. I think it's a lesser miracle to believe that something or someone like God took nothing and made all this than to believe that nothing took nothing and made all of this. So he believes in he has much more miracle believing faith than I do. So thanks for the question, Pixel.
Perfect. Thank you.
Right.
You bet.
You Pixel. Bobby, are you content to keep going for a little bit, or do you want to wrap up kind of now? Or
yeah, I could do one more question and I'll have to jump off.
Okay, let's see.
Or I could do closing comments or something like that, whatever you want.
Let's see. Okay, I will ask a question and then we'll finish with that question that I'm interested in. So just to, if you don't mind, just to take a slightly different view on one thing you said. Reformed. I'm not reform. I'm not myself a Reformed epistemologist. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts on this. When I read folks like Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig, who espouse this Reformed epistemology of a properly basic belief, and Christianity being a properly basic belief, I'm not sure that Christianity really is a properly basic belief. So my rational confidence in Christianity is predicated exclusively on the public evidences. Now, I certainly experience, joy in the gospel and excitement about, scripture and the truths about God and so forth. But that joy and excitement is something which flows out of my rational persuasion that Christianity is actually true. And since it flows out of the propositional truths, it therefore cannot be a justification for those propositional truths. And when I read people like William Lane Craig and Alvin Plantinga talk about, and I've seen this in many other apologists as well, talk about the inner witness of the Spirit, which gives confidence independently of evidence of the truth of Christianity. I'm not really sure what they mean in a way that's different from what a Mormon means when he talks about the burning in the bosom experience. So I don't feel any experience that I would consider to be veridical, and that is truth attesting. Just finally, and I'll let you comment, just Romans 8 is the text that often people go to prove this from Scripture, where it speaks about from verse 15, for he did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but he received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and of children then heirs, and so on. What I think Paul is saying here is that the Spirit bears witness that we are indeed saved and children of God by virtue of the fruits that are born in the life of the believer. I think that's the context, because you contrast the fruits of this flesh with the fruits of the Spirit in that chapter. What do you think about what I've said?
Well, I actually, ironically enough, I would share your same sentiment. So here's an example of what I was doing with Pixel, is helping her to try and understand from a pastoral perspective how she could be okay in her faith. And I utilized Reformed epistemology, even though I don't know for sure what I believe about a Reformed epistemology. So I think that the example that he gives of somebody being in a courtroom is a helpful way to, because I would remember a time when I was younger, Jonathan, when somebody told me as a new believer that Jesus wasn't divine. And it was a really smart person that told me that. And I didn't have the training to rebut it. And I found myself not knowing how to give a defense and feeling intimidated by what I was being told, yet still believing that though the evidence looked like it was stacked against the divinity of Jesus, I still believed that Jesus was more than a man. And it helped me in that way as a young believer. And so sometimes when I'm trying to help somebody, like what you did about somebody who might be struggling with eternal conscious torment, I'm one of those guys that I can step back and I'm okay with helping an individual, and I'll draw a certain view within Christianity that I think might help them, even though I'm not exactly sure which view I come down on. And it's not because I'm trying to be wishy-washy. It's just that's how beautiful my faith has become for me, where I can draw on these different views and help people in that way. So I think for me, Jonathan, as you know, being a PhD student, we get so lost in our research that there's so many topics that I can't wait, conditionalism being one of them, Reformed epistemology being one of them, that I'm not exactly sure what position I even hold to on some of that stuff. And so when I'm finished with some of that research, I'm going to look at that more deeply myself. So I think that that's a fair thing. And so I do think that there are people, though, that believe something. So picture Paul, when he experienced the encounter with Jesus. Well, he was taken away into Arabia and he had to be basically discipled. He had to have his Judaism informed by his newfound Christianity. But I could imagine that Paul, had he bumped into somebody the day after he experienced Jesus, I could imagine that his brain was informed by all of his Judaism, his discipleship by Gamaliel, and he would not have had the answers, but he would have been left with something like a Reformed epistemology to say, I don't know how to give an explanation, but I believe it. And if Christianity is true, he was right then to believe it, even if he never went on to get all the information that he did. So the Mormon then and the Christian, we would say, well, what's the difference? Well, if Christianity really is true, then the burning in the bosom that we experience is different than the burning in the bosom that they experience. But because we're supposed to do apologetics and we have the time to submit our emotions to the test, then we can think about stuff. So I would say it works if it really is true. And because we've done the evidential work as Christians and we don't believe that Mormonism is true because it archaeologically doesn't hold up and so on and so forth, we're able to put our reasons to our emotions and clean it up a little bit. But I would go so far to say, if you take a Mormon, a new Mormon and a new Christian in a jungle, and they both bump into each other, but they don't have libraries to test it out, and they're both believing it, I would say that though they both might be saying something like a Reformed epistemology, I would say they both can't be right because they have the burning in the bosom, but I would believe that the Christian turned out to be right. How would you respond to that? I can't let you go now because I want to know what you think in this. You made me think, I was thinking off my feet a little there. So what are your thoughts?
I think that most, if not all, Christians have an evidential faith, if not at least implicitly. So I think when even young believers read the scriptures and they encounter texts like Isaiah 53 and they see they behold the portrait of Christ that's found there, or they read other messianic prophecies, they might not be able to debate like a Tobias Singer or something, but they at least implicitly grasp that, you know, this is a prophecy of Christ. It was written hundreds of years before his birth. And when they read the Gospels, they, I think, implicitly pick up on the signs, the marks, the hallmarks of verisimilitude and truth. Even if they weren't able to express it or articulate it cogently, even if they weren't able to, you know, debate a Bar Ehrman or something like that, they at least implicitly see how it fits together. They read the letters of Paul and they see how it integrates with Acts, and they see the testimony concerning the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, and the appearance of the 500, and Cephas and James and so on. And even if they're not able to express it at an academic level, they at least implicitly grasp it. And so I think that someone might appear to have a faith that's not grounded in evidence because they're just not able to articulate it well, even though at some level, at a very basic level, they do have an evidential faith, which I think part of the process of spiritual maturing for a believer is to grow such that what was at first implicit becomes explicit.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would say, again, like what happened to Paul was just kind of quick. Or you think about Muslims who have these dreams and they just have these encounters, and it's just boom. I like what so maybe what it is on the front end, it looks more like a Reformed epistemology, but as it goes on, it becomes more explicit. But I would want those who are watching us, Jonathan, right now, that see how this is what is so comforting, is we're able to dialogue with each other because we're not so tied to a position. Like, we're willing to dialogue about it and be friendly and cordial. And that's why I think we need to realize we have to think about what our rhetoric looks like when we have these conversations. And I think, Jonathan, you do such a great job. And I've heard you up against first-rate intellects, on Unbelievable or whatever, and you know how to be firm, but you know how to remain gracious. And I love that about you, and I appreciate that about you. And I really just want to encourage those who are listening to know that, you know, there's a security that comes to our life when we've studied more of the different options, because we don't have to be threatened by questions. We don't have to be worried about what people are going to bring up and ask us. And we can just sit back and we can be able to say, let's see where the evidence leads. And Jonathan, even through some of his questions, you know, I'll get off and think more about what he shared, and that's great. And I'm just so thankful for this time. And Jonathan, before I get off, do you mind if I pray for Pixel with you right now?
Yeah, that would be great.
Let's do that. Father, I just want to thank you. Number one, I thank you for Jonathan. I love his heart for you. I love how he exhibits so much humility. Lord, I see him as just a rising star in the intellectual world, and God's going to use him in amazing ways. And I'm so excited for him and his fiance, and I just pray that you'll bless them and their marriage and their honeymoon, and just be with his fiance in any ways that some of the emotional doubts that might be bothering her per her question. Just give her such great comfort and bless them in their ministry in amazing ways. And be with Pixel, I pray that you would help her with her doubts and her questions. And Holy Spirit, right now, I pray that you would just go and touch her. And I pray for everybody listening right now that you just help us to realize that, hey, we got together to talk about some doubt and some troubles. I think the beauty of the story, Jesus, with you is in the way you handled John the Baptist is what you show us is that, yes, Jesus can handle our doubts. You didn't freak out. You didn't panic. And you even love doubters. And you even know how to pay a compliment to doubters. Behold, this is the one who is greater than anyone born among women. I just pray that you'll comfort our listeners and help us, God, to go and have a spirit-filled day in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Jonathan, thank you for the opportunity to be on your program, bro. I really appreciated it, bud.
Thanks so much for coming on, Bobby. It's always great to have you.
Yeah, thank you. And if I can encourage people that are there, check out our program, 1minuteapologist.com. We've got about 1,000 videos. Jonathan's been a guest as well. And we've got a podcast with my host of that, Tim Hull. And you can learn more about becoming a team member and all the different things there. So, hey, it was great being with you. I really appreciate it, Jonathan. And let's do this again sometime.
Absolutely. Take care. Have a great day.
Yeah. God bless you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.